So good morning. It's great to see so many familiar faces and also new friends in the audience and also online today. Today we would like to welcome Professor Shelley Fishkin's talk on Can Literature Come to the Rescue When History is Under Siege? How one novel can be a Trojan horse to engage questions some politicians don't want us to ask. This talk is hosted by Fund for Change Climate, Eco-Poetics, and Earth Justice Research Lab of the Institute of European American Studies and the English and American Literature Association of Taiwan, and also the Humanities for the Environment Observatory. My name is Serena Zhou, and I'm an Associate Professor of Literature here at the Institute, and currently the Chair of Fund for Change. For the past 3 years, FFC hosted more than 20 talks and events by speakers whose work have inspired our research and activism. And Professor Fishkin, a teacher, a colleague, and a friend to many of us for over 20 years, is such a person. Professor Shelley Fishkin is the Joseph Atha Professor of Humanities, Professor of English, and by courtesy, Professor of African and African American Studies at Stanford University, where she directed the American Studies program for over 20 years. Professor Fishkin, who holds a PhD in American Studies from Yale, is the award-winning author, editor, or co-editor of 50 and more books. Most recently, Huckleberry Finn's Comrade, published in April 2025 in Yale's Black Lives biography series here. And the 29th volume, Oxford Mark Twain, the Encyclopedia of Civil Rights in America, Writing America Literary Landmarks from Walden Pond to Wounded Knee, and the Chinese and the Iron Road, Building the Transcontinental Railroad Project, in which Professor Jade and also Professor Wang, who's on her way here, probably stuck in the traffic somewhere but maybe online, involved. Professor Fishkin is also the past president of the American Studies Association and co-founder of the Journal of Transnational American Studies. She was awarded the Carboat and Norman Holmes Pearson Prize for Lifetime Achievement and Outstanding Contribution to American Studies from the American Studies Association, and the Olivia Langdon Clements Award for Scholarly Innovation and Creativity by the Mark Twain Circle of America. In 2019, the American Studies Association created the Shelley Fishkin Prize for International Scholarship in Transnational American Studies to honor her outstanding dedication to the field. Of course, for her friends here in the audience and fans who know her through her work around Taiwan, Professor Fishkin is more than just this list of achievements. So it is with great pleasure that we have Professor Fishkin today. Let's welcome her.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Tsui-yu, for your very warm welcome and for having me, and thank you to the Institute for European American Studies, Academic Sinica, and the Association of English Language and Literature in Taiwan. And thank you to Wang for setting all of this in motion. And it's wonderful to see all of you. It's wonderful to see old friends and to make some new friends. It's also an honor to be on a platform with translator and teacher Wang, who in many ways is the hero of Chapter 6 in my book, which deals with translations, and also Professor Jade, who's really a broadly honored. So teaching America's past and present in all its complexity has never been an easy task. But the very project itself is increasingly under attack today in American schools. During the last few years, under pressure from right-wing politicians, more than half of U.S. states have passed measures designed to discourage or prevent teachers from teaching their students about the role that racism has played in America's past and present. These laws ban the teaching of what I view as an accurate version of our nation's past. But I have long believed that art can illuminate truths that politicians who pass these laws prefer to bury. If we let, and that's key, only if we let. So today I wanted to suggest that teaching Adventures of Huckleberry Finn has the potential to let teachers do an end run around the right-wing ban on a topic that they are forbidden in many cases to address on its own, the role that racism has played in America's past. Recognized as a classic, this celebrated canonical novel, written by a very dead, very white male author, is in short a book that can be a Trojan horse, able to open our classrooms to issues these politicians don't want discussed. As I'll show today, teaching this iconic text responsibly requires that we bring the history of American racism into our classrooms. Making sense of the novel compels us to examine the ways in which interlocking institutions, from the church to the law to the scientific establishment, conspired to reinforce racism in antebellum Missouri. In fact, in the 19th century, entire country. Our efforts to examine that de facto conspiracy terrifies the right, since it shines a light on the broad contours of institutional racism that they prefer to bury. But it's central to the world that Twain portrays in the novel. The book offers a critical lens on America's complex history, challenging readers to confront uncomfortable truths about racism and societal norms, and engaging them in profound discussions of race, morality, and empathy. This searing satire can bring the history of racism in America into classrooms in engaging and powerful ways. But while conservatives want to ban an accurate view of the chapters of the past that this book engages from America's classrooms, progressives have challenged the book's presence in classrooms for other reasons. They charge that it bolsters the racism that it attacks. Those who want the book banned view Jim, its central black character, as a figure out of a minstrel show, an emblem of the author's alleged racism. But I argue in my new book that Jim is a compelling challenge to minstrel stereotypes and to racism itself. I was convinced from the first time I read the book in high school that Jim was a smart, self-aware, and enormously admirable man who is hemmed in on all sides by a morally bankrupt society that gave him the same rights as his mistress's cows and chickens. A man whose movements, speech, and behavior are constrained on every front by the determination of those around him to keep him enslaved. Huck doesn't seem that way, but I sensed that Twain did. Indeed, the whole point of the book, as I understood it, was to challenge the legitimacy of a society that treated him the way it did. Although the novel is narrated by a boy who, like young Sam Clemens, did not question the justice of the world in which he lived, the novel was written not by Huck, but by a Mark Twain, who by 1885 was ready to challenge the norms that he had accepted as a child. Sadly, over the last 140 years, more often than not, critics viewed Jim as a character instead who embodied stereotypes drawn from minstrelsy, seeing him as a very limited comic foil to the white child who's at the story's center. Now, there have been some notable exceptions. Indeed, my work builds on the work of many wonderful critics who have not mistaken Huck's view of Jim for Twain's. These include Sterling Brown, Ralph Ellison, David Lionel Smith, Jocelyn Chadwick, Robert Paul Lamb, Wallace Robinson, Ralph Wiley, Hilton Obenson, and many others. But the majority of critics did not give Jim his due. In short, Jim has been sold down the river for nearly a century now. I argue in this book that Jim has been hiding in plain sight, that he is more complex and multi-layered than meets the eye. Paying him the attention that he deserves opens up new ways of understanding the history of racism in America. It shines a spotlight on the lives of real individuals who shaped Twain's portrayal of him. And it offers distinctive insights into the challenges of representing Black intelligence, emotion, and creativity in a world that denied their existence. A challenge shouldered not only by Twain himself, but by scores of writers, Black and white, who followed. To address why so many critics, well into our own time, have persisted in disparaging, demeaning, and dismissing Jim, I knew I would first need to live the context and conditions he would have encountered as an enslaved person in antebellum Missouri, and the broader cultural conversation about race that shaped his life. And I would need to make a case for the idea that by the time Twain wrote this book, he had learned for the most part to reject the myths about race that his culture widely accepted. I knew I would need to jump into the critical debates and demonstrate that Twain's understanding of who Jim had prompted him to craft not a stereotypical character in a minstrel show, but rather a man Twain admired and wanted us to admire as well. The world of slavery that Jim entered in antebellum Missouri was a world, as Twain recalled, in which the local pulpit taught that God approved of slavery, that it was a holy thing. It was a world in which enslaved people were prohibited from learning to read or write, and where their speech, mobility, social interactions, and deportment were constrained at every turn. A slave could receive up to 39 lashes just for directing insulting language to a white person. And anyone who helped runaways was severely punished. Slave catchers lurking along the Illinois shore made escape highly precarious. It was a world in which children could be sold away from their parents on a whim, say if the master wanted to buy a new piece of furniture for the house. Mark Twain was born into this world in 1835. 50 years later, he would become the first white male writer to portray a slave determined to be a father, and a surrogate father, even to a white child. Indeed, Jim is the first fully drawn black father in American fiction. It was also a world in which a set of assumptions about race that we recognize today as false and offensive were taken for granted by a broad swathe of the public. Racist beliefs characterizing African Americans as inferior to whites in the U.S. dates back at least to Thomas Jefferson, who had asserted in his Notes on the State of Virginia in 1785 that blacks were less capable than whites at using reason, feeling grief, and exercising their imagination. The idea that black people were unintelligent, insensitive to pain, and uncreative became increasingly entrenched in American culture as slaveholders like Jefferson used it to justify slavery. After the Civil War, the widespread persistence of these beliefs helped garner support for the black codes and segregation. These myths about black people dominated not only popular culture, but also so-called scientific theories of race at the time. These racist views pervaded Mark Twain's society for the entirety of his life and well beyond it. Indeed, Huck Finn buys into all of them at the start of the novel that bears his name. And as we'll see, this parallels Twain's own belief through his adolescence and early adulthood. But during the years leading up to Huck Finn, Twain's personal encounters with a number of black individuals made clear to him the distance between those myths and reality, prompting him to challenge and subvert them as he crafted his most famous black character. Throughout his life, we've remembered that Twain often found that prejudices held by those around him towards specific ethnic groups or races dissolved when he got to know individuals belonging to those groups. For example, as a child, he imbibed negative stereotypes of Jews and viewed them as proper objects of scorn. He and his friends even chased and threw stones at the two little Levin boys, the only Jewish children in his town. But some years later, on the Comstock Road in Nevada, Twain met a brilliant and public-spirited Jewish engineer and inventor named Adolf Sutro, and was so impressed that he permanently revised his view of Jews. As he wrote a friend in 1885, 20 years ago, I knew Adolf Sutro well, of Sutro Tunnel, a fine, manly, beautiful character. And I have always found something of Sutro in all the Jews whom I have known personally since. And part of Sutro is sufficient equipment for an average man, end quote. As a result of this personal experience, Twain rejected his early prejudices and became a lifelong strong advocate for Jews. A similar dynamic characterized his response to the prevalent myths about black people. Chapter 2 of my book describes 8 individuals who prompted Twain to reject these myths. All of them blasted to smithereens the myth that black people had no ability to think rationally, imagine creatively, or feel pain and grief, and each contributed in distinctive ways to his characterization of Jim. In addition, 3 of them were fathers, as Twain himself was when he was writing the novel. Let me briefly tell you about a few of them and share some of what made him change his views. During his first trip to Europe, recounted in his travel book Innocents Abroad, Twain voices a steady patter of complaint about the stupidity, arrogance, and irritating manner of every tour guide the group met, except one. In addition to constantly trying to get them to buy things they didn't want and constantly bombarding them with tiresome, boring myths, the tour guide spoke an incomprehensible guide English, as Twain called it, that drove Twain mad. The guide's tongues are never still, he wrote. But then in Venice, Twain encountered a guide who was erudite and eloquent, a cultivated, well-spoken man who happened to be the child of 2 South Carolina slaves who had brought him to Venice as a child. Twain praises his knowledge, skill, and style, which stand out all the more in contrast to the insufferably ignorant and coarse other guides they met on the trip. Quote, "The guide I have spoken of is the only one we have yet had who knew anything. He was born in South Carolina of slave parents. They came to Venice when he was an infant. He has grown up here. He is well educated. He reads, speaks, writes, and speaks English. He reads, writes, and speaks English, Italian, Spanish, and French with perfect facility. He is a worshiper of art and thoroughly conversant with it, knows the history of Venice by heart, and never tires of talking of her illustrious career. He dresses better than any of us and is daintily polite. Negroes are deemed as good as white people in Venice, and so this man feels no desire to go back to his native land. His judgment is correct." I think one would be hard-pressed to find as admiring a description of any black person by any white writer in this time, anywhere. It's 1867 that Twain publishes this. 5 months after his account of the erudite black man in Venice appeared in print, Twain became acquainted with another extremely intelligent black man, editor, publisher, and abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Twain's father-in-law had aided the formerly enslaved Douglass in his flight to freedom, and Douglass had remained a family friend. Twain and Douglass were delighted to see each other when they met again in Boston in 1869, as Twain noted in a letter to his fiancée. He may have met the gifted black guide in Venice and the brilliant Frederick Douglass during the decade before he began writing Huckleberry Finn. But in addition, he had daily contact with a tremendously smart black man during the years he was writing the novel. Although he had a wife and home in Hartford of his own, most of the time when the Clemens family was in Hartford, George Griffin stayed in a room off the 3rd floor billiard room where Mark Twain did his writing during autumn, winter, and spring. George Griffin was nominally the family's butler, but he was also Twain's billiard companion and sounding board, and was the person to whom Twain read chapter drafts as he worked. Twain called Griffin smart and intelligent, shrewd and wise, resourceful and quick-thinking. He tells us that Griffin ruled his race in the town and was its trusted political leader. I'm quoting Twain here. He could tell the Republican committee how his vote would go to a man before polls opened on election day. His people sought his advice in their troubles, and he kept many a case of theirs out of court by settling it himself. End quote. It was not only the city's black population, however, whose trust and friendship Griffin earned. He was well and credibly known to the white public, best whites in the town, Twain writes, and he had the respect and I may say warm, friendly regard of every visiting gentleman of our house. End quote. Griffin sagely turned this goodwill into more than social capital. He managed to wrest from it what was in those days a significant chunk of financial capital as well, by gathering information that would allow him to place smart political bets. In order for Griffin to bet intelligently on state and national elections, he had to be methodical, systematic, painstaking, and thorough in his meticulous research, Twain writes. Twain noted that in addition to having a remarkably good head, Griffin had an acute financial eye, both of which enabled him to become a relatively wealthy man at a time when Mark Twain himself had to declare bankruptcy. The financial support that Twain gave to one of the first black law students at Yale the same year that he wrote Huckleberry Finn is further evidence that he had fully rejected the myth of black mental inferiority. It was not a universal perspective, however, even among his avowedly liberal peers. Some influential friends of Twain, such as Hartford Courant editor Charles Dudley Warner, argued that higher education for African Americans encouraged idleness among them. Twain disagreed. What of the myth that black people didn't experience grief and pain the way white people did? Excuse me. As Jefferson had put it, their griefs are transient. The belief that black people were relatively inured to personal loss and tragedy helped justify the practice of separating families when doing so was in a slaveholder's financial interest. But a formerly enslaved woman named Mary Ann Cord taught Twain the emptiness of this canard. One evening, Cord, who was the cook at Quarry Farm where Clemens' family spent summers, told Twain the moving story of how she was separated from her husband and the last of her 7 children on the auction block. She told it in her own distinctive voice, and it left a real impression on Twain, who called it a remarkably strong piece of literary art to come untutored, to come from lips untutored in literary art. I say, a remarkably strong piece of literary work to come from lips untutored in literary art, end quote. He did his best to put it down on the page exactly as she told it, evoking her speech painstakingly and with enormous respect. Cord's story of the grief and pain she felt at her separation from her last child and her joy at being reunited with him after the war became Twain's first contribution to the prestigious Atlantic Monthly. He called it a true story repeated word for word as I heard it. His decision to publish a story evoking the wrenching pain that Cord had suffered is all the more bold when we realize that the norm in the Atlantic Monthly, as well as other mass magazines at this time, was not to acknowledge black grief. For most white Americans during the last quarter of the 19th century, the pain that African Americans had suffered under slavery was displaced by tales of ex-slaves nostalgic for the old plantation, befuddled by freedom, insanely loyal to their former masters, individuals for whom freedom was a burden and a curse. At a time when the reigning ideology of the day assumed that, quote, Negroes were relatively insensible to pain, as Jefferson wrote, Cord's description of what she felt at her separation from her children on the auction block was moving proof of the myopic fallacy of this assertion. And what of the myth that black people were completely uncreative? As Jefferson had put it, quote, never yet could I find a black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, end quote. While throughout the 19th century, many Americans dismissed the idea of black creativity as cavalierly as Jefferson did, Mark Twain had the good fortune to know several individuals whose creative storytelling and rhetorical gifts challenged this assumption. One was Daniel Quarles, an enslaved man Twain cites as an inspiration for Jim. Quarles' storytelling was legendary, and hearing his stories was a high point of Twain's stay at his uncle's farm every summer as a child. At that point in his life, Twain had no way of predicting that storytelling would be central to his own future. But when he became a storyteller himself, he presumably hoped to engage his readers as fully as Daniel Quarles' story had engaged him. And indeed, he made Quarles' storytelling the centerpiece of a book of Twain's entitled How to Tell a Story. If Daniel Quarles had a deep impact on Twain's sense of how to tell a story, it was another enslaved man named Jerry who introduced Twain to satire as a tool of social criticism. Twain wrote that he was, quote, a gay and impudent and satirical and delightful young black man, a slave, who daily preached sermons from the top of his master's woodpile with me for the sole audience, end quote. 50 years later, Twain recalled, quote, to me he was a wonder. I believed he was the greatest man in the United States, end quote. Jerry would satirize the sermons of the local preachers, making a case for the irresistible pull of conformity as he himself performed a nonconformist rhetorical tour de force for an audience of one. The audacious doubleness of Jerry's verbal brilliance thrilled Twain, who claims to have had the good sense to know he was in the presence of a real master, even if that master was a slave. Twain had ample reason then to reject Jefferson's assertion that black people could not utter a thought above the level of pure narration. For Daniel Quarles had taught him lessons about how to tell a story that he would return to all his life, And Jerry had taught him lessons about the power of satire that he still recalled in vivid detail after half a century. He wrote those words about Jerry 50 years after he wrote them. Individuals like these exploded the myth that black people had no ability to think rationally, feel grief, and imagine creatively. And each of them helped shape Twain's characterization of Jim. But it's important to note, it's crucial to note, that while Twain has good reasons to recognize these myths for what they are, Huck does not. Huck is clearly familiar with these myths about black people, outlined here, and he buys into them to a large extent, as Twain himself did when he was a child. Only over the course of the book does Huck learn to question some of them. Now, since Huck is narrator of the book that bears his name, we see everything through Huck's eyes. Huck buys into this myth, but Twain does not. These myths. One insightful critic recognized this when the book came out. As far as I can tell, only one, exactly when the book came out. And this was a reviewer in the San Francisco Chronicle in 1885 who noted that, quote, running all through the book is the sharpest satire on the antebellum estimate of the slave, end quote. Alas, the Chronicle's savvy understanding of the book was an outlier. Most, but not all reviewers, over the century that followed and beyond, have tended to confuse the perspective of the book's narrator with that of its author, and assumed that Twain, as well as Huck, bought into the myths that are outlined here in the stereotypes. And this isn't to say that people who knew Twain well bought into them and didn't read the book properly, but they didn't necessarily leave a written record of this the year it came out. Leo Marx wrote in The American Scholar in 1953, in what some consider the most anthologized essay about the book, that, quote, Jim has been made over in the image of a flat stereotype, the submissive stage Negro. And ever since, many scholars have repeated the charge. In 1985, for example, Frederick Woodard and Donnery McCann wrote in the Mark Twain Journal that Jim is forever frozen within the convention of the minstrel darky. But is Jim drawn from minstrelsy, and does Twain present him as an object of ridicule? Born in the 1830s, blackface minstrel shows became the most popular form of entertainment in 19th century America. The actors, who were usually white men with their faces black to a burnt pork, portrayed ludicrous blacks who were bumptious and boastful, fatuous fools who deserved to be objects of derision, but who were able to also make fun of the upper classes in ways that working class audiences found appealing. The white men in blackface who appeared in the minstrel shows that Twain saw in Hannibal, New York, San Francisco, and elsewhere portrayed black figures who were variously stupid, proud, gullible, ignorant, confident, passive, lazy, and impervious to pain. Undergirded by the pretense that slavery was right and natural, these shows helped white Americans deny the brutality of slavery. After slavery's end, they helped them ignore the continuing injustices and indignities inflicted on black Americans. Twain himself had fond memories of minstrel shows. But what does this have to do with Jim? The argument that Jim's character is based on minstrel stereotypes goes like this. Minstrel shows demean black people. Mark Twain liked minstrel shows. Therefore, Mark Twain crafted Jim in the demeaning image of the Negro of the minstrel stage. Many critics since the 1950s, since Leo Marx wrote that, have claimed to identify echoes of minstrel show dialogues, humor, and language in episodes involving Jim and Huck Finn. But we have to remember that Twain recognized that what minstrel shows presented had little or nothing to do with reality. As he wrote 3 years before he began Huck Finn, and this is a really important comment, the so-called Negro minstrels simply misrepresent the thing. I do not think they ever saw a plantation, end quote. Although Twain enjoyed minstrel shows, he viewed them as fundamentally artificial concoctions created as a form of stylized entertainment. Why would Twain use a form of popular entertainment shot through with nostalgia for the slave South as a key source for a book that mounted a devastating critique of that world? The racial counterfeit that was a minstrel show, that's Eric Lott's phrase, with its premise of black stupidity, its nostalgia for the world of slavery, and its speech as exaggerated and broad as the garish costumes and makeup, was not the key source for Jim that many have claimed it was. Seeing Jim as a figure rooted in stereotypes stereotypical, flat, passive, fatuous stage Negro of the minstrel show requires that we overlook the many occasions when Jim demonstrates knowledge, skill, agency, empathy, intellect, and understanding, as well as an awareness of the extent to which he can openly show these qualities to white people. As it turns out, every example cited to demonstrate that Jim embodies stereotypes drawn from minstrelsy may alternatively be seen to highlight Jim's perceptive strategies for self-preservation and self-empowerment. And my argument here builds on the work of all the critics I named earlier. Let me just give some brief examples. Excuse me. Take the scene in which we meet Jim in chapter 2. So all of you recall, Huck and Jim decide to steal a couple of candles from the widow's kitchen. And they find Jim sitting under some trees near the kitchen door. They don't answer when he asks who's there. They're sure he hasn't spotted them. When he starts to snore, they're sure he's asleep. Tom sneaks by, steals the candles, and leaves a nickel on the kitchen table for them. And then Tom decides to play a prank on Jim by hanging his hat from a branch from the tree limb. And when the boys leave, Jim palms the nickel. And afterwards, Jim tells a wild, over-the-top story claiming that witches bewitched him, put him into a trance, and rode him all over the state before setting him down under the trees again and hanging his hat on a limb to show Jim. As Huck tells us, the next time Jim told it, quote, he said they rode him down to New Orleans, and after that, every time he told it, spread it out more and more, till by the end, he said they rode him all over the world and tired him most to death, end quote. Jim hangs the 5-cent piece around his neck and then claimed it was a charm the devil had given him with his own hands. And slaves would come from all over and give Jim gifts just to get a glimpse of that charm and to hear him tell the story of how he got it. Chadwick Hansen wrote in 1963 that, quote, the Jim of this first episode is a recognizable type, the comic stage Negro. We're free to laugh at him because his ignorance is so subhuman that he cannot feel mental pain, end quote. In a similar vein, Woodard and McCann wrote in 1985, quote, the swaggering buffoonery of the minstrel clown is represented early in the novel when Jim awakes and finds his hat in a tree, one of Tom's tricks, and then concocts a tale about witches and the devil. Jim and the other slaves have a superstition-steeped mind that gives the whole scene a minstrel flavor, end quote. But there's a very different way that we can read this scene. So what would we do if we heard a noise in the dark that we couldn't identify? What would you do? Well, I know what I would do is I would just listen. I would just be quiet and listen and wait and see if I heard it again. I would not announce, well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to sit here and listen until I hear it again. The latter behavior, loudly announcing that you're going to listen, is the kind of thing one would say to humored children who think they've managed to hide from you, when you know perfectly well where they are. Why would Twain tell us that Huck tell us he fell over a root and made a noise while he's sneaking up on Jim? Or why the next moment would he have Huck struggle with not being able to scratch an itch and tell us about it in great detail? Seemed like I'd die if I couldn't scratch, Huck says. The boys are making a lot of noise. They're making a racket, and Jim has heard them. Rather than being the gullible victim of a hoax, he's an adult who's let some children think they've fooled him in order to make them happy. After the boys leave, Jim retrieves his hat from the branch where Tom left it and is glad to claim the nickel that Tom left for the candles. But how does he account for having the money? He creatively spins a highly imaginative, exciting tale and tells it over and over again for the delight of his audiences who pay him things to get him to tell it. He becomes, in effect, an author paid for telling stories, not unlike Twain himself. Huck does not see Jim's creative achievement for what it is. A number of critics, sadly, have had the same problem. Or take another scene critics often see rooted in minstrel shows, the scene where Huck and Jim discuss King Solomon. The idea that Solomon is ready to cut a child in two outrages Jim, a father who deeply cares for his children. While he does miss the point the Bible story is trying to make about Solomon's wisdom, he actually makes a different and quite trenchant point himself. When Jim tells us that a child or two are no consequence to Solomon, he's implicitly making the slaveholder he's implicitly invoking the slaveholder who heartlessly deals with children of the enslaved, separating them from their parents without a thought. Frederick Douglass heard Twain give a reading of this section of the book in the Congregational Church in Washington, D.C. on November 24, 1885, and came backstage to chat with him afterwards? Would Douglas, who deplored the offensiveness of minstrel shows and all they stood for, have embraced his friend's performance with the enthusiasm he did if it had struck him as redolent of a minstrel show? There is humor in this section, to be sure, as there is in most of the book, but it's not humor at Jim's expense. Jim's reasoning and the intensity of his emotional response to the story are both compelling and understandable. Jim is unlettered and ignorant, but he is still smart. And his unexpected response to Huck's tale of Solomon's so-called wisdom make us like and expect him, not think less of him. Excuse me. Or take the scene in chapter 15 when Huck and Jim become separated in the fog. Another section of the book in which some scholars find echoes of minstrelsy. Jim falls asleep, as you recall, in despair. When he sees Huck is gone, he thinks he's drowned. And then when Jim wakes and sees Huck next to him, he's overjoyed. But Huck decides to play a practical joke on him and insists that he must have been dreaming. Jim behaves in the scene as any parent would who wants to lead a child to admit he's lying. I'm sure this is familiar to any of you who have children. He carefully reconstructs what happened during the night, step by step, giving Huck chance after chance to confess to the cruel prank that he's played on him. On the one person who genuinely cares about him, Huck continues to insist it was all a dream. After failing to get Huck to admit he's lying, Jim decides to give him what he seems to be asking for, a clownish, stereotypical performance. As Jim concocts his detailed interpretation of the alleged dream, Twain has him call Huck boss, a name he hasn't used before, but that would be at home in a minstrel show. Well, looky here, boss, Jim says. He calls Huck boss twice in this scene, but nowhere else in the book. When Huck points to the trash that has washed onto the raft during what was clearly an actual storm, Jim is silent for 5 minutes as he weighs his options. The child needed to be taught a lesson, but he was a white child after all, and it wasn't clear how Jim might go about doing that. Jim's decision to play the fool Huck wants, the fool that Huck wants to make of him at first, and then the long pause, the 5-minute pause he takes before he levels a rebuke in which he calls Huck trash. He basically calls Huck white trash. Conveys how self-aware and perceptive Jim actually is during this scene. Then there is, of course, the issue of Jim's language, which critics often say is straight out of minstrel shows. I address that by focusing on the pains that Twain took to distinguish Jim's speech from the kind of talk found in minstrel shows, what I call minstrelese. Twain listened with care to black speakers and carefully tried to capture key characteristics of their speech on the page. While most of Twain's white contemporaries who wrote black dialect used it solely for comic purposes, Twain did not. Marianne Cord, as well as other black speakers he knew, had taught him that black dialect was as capable as standard English of conveying strong emotions and conveying concrete information as well. To prove this latter point, and also to show off a bit and show his own virtuosity, in 1882, Twain wrote his publisher a letter detailing the kinds of editing he was willing to accept in a manuscript he was sending him. And the letter would be unremarkable were it not for the fact that Twain decided to write it entirely in what his publisher would recognize as black dialect. For Twain, black dialect was as viable a mode of speech as any other, for expressing arguments, insights, and emotions in a range of registers. This is, after all, a novel in which characters with the most educated and elevated speech and the most correct grammar, the king and the duke, are two of the most morally reprehensible characters in the book. So speech is no indication of character. Twain crafted Jim's speech with enormous care. At one point, when Twain was revising the emotionally powerful scene in which Jim expresses his guilt over having hit his deaf daughter before realizing she was deaf, he began to fear that the copy editor might make Jim's speech more stereotypical and less readable than he wanted it to be. And so in the left-hand margin, Twain wrote a note to the copy editor in pencil. "This expression shall not be changed." There are dozens of other examples of pains Twain took to differentiate Jim's speech from minstrelese. For example, actors in minstrel show always say river for river and have for have. I have this, I have that. And give for give. while Jim always says river, have, and give. Actors in minstrel shows say ting for thing and think, and tink for think, but Jim always says thing and think, and there are myriad other examples as well. Whether we focus on the lexicon, grammar, or orthography of Jim's speech, Twain wanted to make sure Jim most definitely did not sound like someone in a minstrel show. His many corrections in the manuscript, even his instructions in the margins to the copy editor, bear this out. There's also a problem when it comes to cultural and literary sources that are supposedly roots of scenes involving Jim. Portions of the book involving Jim that critics claim to be derived from minstrelsy turn out to come from sources including African spiritual traditions, the works of William Shakespeare, and a book that Twain's friend William Wright composed in Twain's home. Meanwhile, a section involving the White King and Duke, as it turns out, probably does have its roots in minstrelsy. So while minstrelsy was likely one likely source that shaped aspects of the book, it was not necessarily the key source for scenes involving Jim. The assumption that minstrel shows were the most significant influence shaping Twain's creation of the main black character in the novel is both facile and misleading. The great black poet and critic Sterling Brown understood this. In his book, The Negro in American Fiction, in 1937, Brown called Jim, quote, the best example in 19th century fiction of the average Negro slave, and he is completely believable, end quote. Some 30 years after Brown wrote these words, they would be echoed by Langston Hughes, who called the character of Jim in Huckleberry Finn, quote, one of the best portraits in American fiction of an unlettered slave clinging to the hope of freedom, end quote. The inadequacy of the minstrel show's paradigm to describe Jim becomes clear when we attend to dimensions of Jim's character that challenge minstrel stereotypes, when we focus on the care with which Twain differentiated his speech from minstrelese, and when we probe alternative cultural, literary, and real-life sources for episodes involving Jim. Critics' obsession with viewing Jim through the lens of minstrel shows reveals their own limitations rather than Twain's. And by the way, one critic I took great pleasure in attacking in this book was me. Like many others, I too misunderstood and misread Jim for a very long time, making comments that I published in the 1990s about Jim's having a diminished voice. I reject that view now and say so clearly here. Jim is a complex and resourceful enslaved man seeking his freedom in a world determined to keep him enslaved. A father bereft at his separation from his children, a self-possessed man who is loyal to his friends and who loves his family. He is someone who sizes up people and situations with clarity and insight, who performs roles he's expected to perform when he believes that doing so will help him reach his goal. He is a man who acts with enviable wisdom, tact, insight, and agency in the face of a society in which everything is stacked against him. Twain respected Jim, and so should we. Why has he been so misjudged? Excuse me. Well, one reason is the tendency to forget that we're getting Huck's view of Jim and not Twain's. Huck buys into the culture's popular myths about black people and is unaware of how much Jim is constrained from showing him his real feelings and thoughts. Another reason is the difficulty many have in imagining that a middle-class white man could get so beyond those myths and stereotypes that he could create a black character who's smart, admirable, and indeed the moral center of the novel. A third reason is that dialect makes people uncomfortable, and many assume that Jim was being ridiculed, as was normally the case when dialect appeared in print in the 19th century. But Twain was doing something completely different. I don't have time today to focus in detail on Jim's afterlives in theater and film and translation and in the high school classroom, but I do want to share just a couple of things I found that surprised me. One is how fascinating it was to find astute critics of the book in unexpected places, like Hollywood, Broadway, and a Catholic boys' school in New Jersey. Some of the actors who played Jim had important insights into his character. Archie Moore, the world light heavyweight boxing champion, who played Jim in an MGM film in 1960, said that, quote, Jim is not an educated man, but he uses his head to accomplish what he needs, end quote. And Ron Richardson, who played Jim on Broadway in 1985, noted that, quote, Jim has to have survival techniques, teaching Huck the lessons of life without letting him know he's being taught. And he has to be shrewd enough to realize that his life is up to the whims of two white boys, end quote. There were some surprises in translations of the novel as well. The failure of many translators to grasp the book's satiric critique of racism offers insight into how bigotry, ethnocentrism, and marginalization work around the world. In countries like Germany and France, in which the project of maintaining colonies in Africa was rationalized by assumptions of white supremacy, early translations often gave Jim lines that Twain never wrote, that made him appear stupid and subservient. A German translator from 1913, for example, has Jim make the self-evident observation that he usually walks with his feet, a line nowhere to be found in the book. In addition, many early translators, including a number in China, added errors to Jim's speech, the wrong character or word or punctuation that made him seem either like a language learner or someone who was simple-minded. In her celebrated 2012 edition of Huckleberry Finn, Wang carefully avoided these mistakes. Although many previous translators had Jim, quote, speak with a false Chinese tone in some of the words to highlight his dialect and illiteracy, Wang stresses that while Jim speaks African American English, he is not unintelligent, and for that reason she refuses to have him speak in awkward Chinese that would make him look like an intellectually inferior speaker of gibberish. She believes, as I do, that, quote, Jim is the true hero, end of the book. Quote, a man who manifests true human integrity, a surrogate father who teaches Huck lessons about the essence of human compassion and integrity, end quote. Wang writes, quote, my principle of translation is to remain loyal to the original text and complement with annotations, end quote. Using the main text of the authoritative Mark Twain Project edition of the novel, Wang unpacks opaque words for her readers, such as the meaning of a trot line, a long line left overnight to catch multiple fish, or the significance of the king calling his companion the Duke of Bilgewater instead of Bridgewater, Bilgewater being the foul and obnoxious water in the bottom of a vessel, as Wang tells us. Quote, if I cannot translate the essential flavors and underlying meanings of Mark Twain's words, Wang writes, I explain them in footnotes. 387 footnotes, to be precise. The book also has a lengthy, critical, and long preface by Tae-Sing Shan, a leading theorist and translation studies scholar. Wang has taken to heart Shan's disdain for giving a work the kind of standalone textual autonomy that was a hallmark of the new criticism. Instead, he urges translators to translate the cultural context as well as the words on the page, and Wang has done just that. Her footnotes facilitate both cross-language and cross-cultural communication by detailing the cultural backgrounds, the meanings between the line, and the things she thinks her Chinese readers need to know. Her lengthy introduction even draws analogies to aspects of Chinese culture familiar to her readers. For example, it explores Jim's moral significance by invoking the virtues of sympathy and humaneness associated with the early Confucian philosopher Mencius. I hope that Wang's methods will become influential in future translations of the book in all languages. I am filled with humility when I realize that even a writer as gifted as Mark Twain had such trouble getting his fellow Americans to look at themselves in the mirror. Huck Finn evokes, as perhaps only a work of art can, both the boldness of founding a nation on the ideals laid out in the Declaration of Independence and the brazen hypocrisy that allowed those ideals to be violated so fully from the start. It is perhaps unsurprising that the persistence of racism in our world has fostered a myopia that has prevented many, including myself, from recognizing Jim's full humanity until now. I am awed by Jim's astute ability to weigh the complexities of any situation, by his compassion, by his sense of justice, by his creativity, generosity, and integrity, by his refusal to let a world that denies that he is even human constrain his capacity to love. And I am still stunned by Twain's daring experiment of presenting Jim through the eyes of a child with such limited understanding of what he's seen. And then I realized what trust Twain had in us, his readers. He trusted in our ability to understand things that Huck never did. He trusted us to see through the whitewashed history of America's racist past that was being presented as truth even at the time he wrote, and that is still being presented today. He trusted us to recognize the phenomenon that he would later call, quote, the lie of silent assertion, end The silent assertion that there wasn't anything going on in which humane and intelligent people were interested and are engaged by their duty to try to stop, end quote. Do we have the courage to honor that trust, to be the readers he hoped we could be? The jury is still out. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. And now we have two respondents for Shelley's talk. The first one is Professor Wang. Professor Wang holds a BA, MA, and PhD from National Taiwan University and is a PhD candidate from Penn State University. She was also a visiting scholar at Harvard University and the University of Chicago. After 25 years of teaching and researching at Taiwan University, she founded and chaired the Foreign Language and Literature Department at Fengyue University and taught at Asia University and Soochow University. Her publications include Gulliver's Travel in Qinghua Revisited, A Minian Approach by Peter Lang, 1995, and Updike's Rabbit Saga as a Cultural Critique of American Ideology, Lambert, 2015. As Shelley has pointed out, she's also the Chinese translator of classics such as Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn and last but not least, Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. So, Professor Wang.
Dear Professor Fishkin, I'm honored to be invited to talk about your newly published book. I'm excited to see Jim being justified to be as he should be, as a decent human being. He has been mistreated since 1885 for 140 years, both as a subhuman slave and as a misidentified literary character. As I have said in our emails 2 years ago, congratulations for coming up with another groundbreaking idea since your publication of Was Huck Black, which is generally believed to be the most enlightening book in modern studies. When you mentioned you were going to write a book on Jim, it popped into my mind. If Huck was black, then was Jim white? At the end of chapter 40 in Huckleberry Finn, when Jim insists on sacrificing his own freedom and getting Tom, a doctor, to treat his gun wound, Huck says of Jim, I know he was white inside, which is another big irony. I always believe Jim is probably the most misunderstood and underrated character in American literature, and he certainly deserves a biography. I can't wait to see Jim play the leading role in his own story. I'm also honored to be able to offer help in answering your questions about my opinions on Jim, such as translating Jim's dialect. In the introductory section to my annotated Chinese translation of Huckleberry Finn, I explain my translation principles in dealing with language problems. I do not translate Jim's erroneous and ungrammatical black English into awkward Chinese, as some other translations have done before, because they make Jim's language highly unreadable and difficult to grasp, and most of all, they insult Jim's wisdom, logical thinking, and ability to express. I'm glad to see you quote in your book what I've said, that these translations end up turning Jim into a monster talking gibberish nonsense, which has certainly insulted his intelligence. Jim is merely uneducated, but his intelligence is above average. So I just translate Jim's dialect into easy and colloquial Chinese, as ordinary local people might speak, for it is comparatively more important to convey what Jim wants to say than how he says it. to present Jim as a whole with human integrity, I have to make some sacrifice. In my annotated Chinese translation, early at the beginning of chapter 2, when Jim first appears in the book, I introduce him as the other main character who is going to be the most important influence in Huck's life. I want my readers to pay close attention to Jim during the following reading process. After that, I have about 30 footnotes concerning Jim to remind my readers that he is a main character, a major character, not merely a foil character. Jim may be superstitious and humble, but some of his beliefs contain folk wisdom inherited from his generations of ancestors. Jim is naive, but he has his own logical way of thinking. In your book, you claim that Jim is the first fully portrayed but most misunderstood black character in American fiction. Mark Twain writes that novel entirely in Huck's voice, which is a great unprecedented achievement. Yet many readers do not understand the irony underlying the story told from Huck's perspective. The Jim Huck tells about is not exactly the real Jim. You have done exhaustive research, tracking down Jim's origins, historical context, and minstrel stereotypes. You further explore his afterlives, especially how Jim appears on stage and screen in translation of 67 languages and in high school classrooms. After examining the controversy surrounding this disparate character, you prove that Jim is actually a black father figure based on or influenced by the three black fathers Mark Twain has known for years: Daniel Quayles, John T. Lewis, and Frederick Douglass. In recent years, critical attention has shifted to focus on Jim, especially on Jim's role as Huck's surrogate father, who initiated him into human integrity, in striking contrast to his white trash biological father who abuses and exploits his own son. Huck is able to realize gradually and step by step that Jim is also a human being with inborn natural goodness, a noble savage among the conniving, selfish country people. Without Jim, Huck would never have grown up and triumphed through his moral conflicts. Without Jim, his sound heart would never have conquered the deformed conscience. And now I would like to call Jim, Huck's black father. You insist that Mark Twain makes Jim a multi-layered character with much more complicated than Huck can see, and that has caused all the debates of racism. You even have a chapter 4, an interpretive exercise to rewrite the entire book in Jim's dialect, telling his own version of the story, trying to retain Jim's characteristic manner of speaking without adding or deleting anything that is not in Mark Twain's original. Throughout the book, you have traced the evolution of Mark Twain thinking about race during his youth and adulthood years, as well as his travels around the world. And you conclude that Mark Twain must have been exposed to the idea of white supremacy. Presenting Jim only through the eyes of Huck requires readers who read between the lines to understand things the child does not understand. And as you say in conclusion, quote, to see through the whitewashed history of America's racist past, quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Our second respondent today is Professor Tsui-yu. Professor Lee has obtained her doctorate degree in foreign languages and literature from Taiwan University with a dissertation titled Revisionary Aesthetics Politics, the Creole Fiction of Jean Rice and Michelle Cliff. Currently, she's a full professor in the English department, Dean of the College of Humanities, and the director of EMI Bilingual Education Center at National Kaohsiung Normal University, and then the president of Taiwan's English American Literature Association. Her research interests include Asian American literature, post-colonial fiction, dance studies, ethnic studies, and literary pedagogy. Her major publications include two monographs. The first one is Trauma, Precarity, and War Memories in Asian American Writings, published by Pilgrim Macmillan in 2020, and The Invisible Presence, Literary Imagination of Sino-Caribbean Diaspora, published in 2010 by Fishkin. Professor Lee.
Thank you, Professor Zhou, and thank you for having me. On behalf of English and American Literature Association, I would like to say thank you, for accepting our invitation to give this lecture, and also I would like to say my appreciations to Serena and Sina who make the lecture possible. And of course, personally, it has been a great honor to be here today to reflect on Professor Shelley Fishkin's important and timely talk, Can Literature Come to the Rescue When History is Under Siege? I remember when I was a child, watching cartoon animation of Huckleberry Finn every night over dinner was the fun part. But I have to admit that Jane, for me, was the most disturbing and troubling character. And I simply skipped him to focus on other more adventurous, heroic characters like Finn or Tom Sawyer. Now I come to realize that Twain was right when he said the book was written for adults. Because now I come to know more about the importance of Huckleberry Finn. Now, from my background as an educator, university teacher, teaching American literature for 20 years in Taiwan, today's talk inspires me to rethink my role as an instructor of American literature, and also the function of literature, especially its critical pedagogy. I don't think there could be a more urgent question right now, not just for educators, but for all of us who cared about truth, justice, and how we prepare the next generation to understand the world they live in. All the issues could have global and border-crossing resonance today. Professor Fishkin's work reminds us of something very powerful. That literature is not just about stories. It's about voices, it's about histories and human experiences that often get silenced or forgotten. And in a time when teaching America's complex past or any notorious, traumatized, or secretive chapters in any cultures that have been hidden or overlooked in any official history is being challenged, sometimes even outlawed in parts of the country. A message could not be clear. Books can still break through. They can still spark the conversation that some would rather that we didn't have. Professor Fishkin asked us to take another look at the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a book many of us have read in school, perhaps without fully realizing how radical or sophisticated it can be. It's a book often taught as a classic, but also one that's being banned, criticized, and misunderstood, as Professor Fishkin has declared. Some see the character of Jane as a stereotype, frozen in the racist tradition of minstrelsy, but Professor Fishkin gave us a new way to see him, one that is grounded in deep research, empathy, and literary insight. Now back to her book's title, Hero, Jane. Let's think about Jane for a moment. For me, if only met Jane through cartoons like me, you might remember a version of him that feels more like a joke rather than a person. He's mostly soft-spoken, superstitious, and always running scared. And in some of the black and white films or animated versions, Jane barely gets a full sentence out without stuttering or saying something like lousy, like he just saw a ghost. Sometimes he's portrayed as wide-eyed, barefoot, and always 2 steps behind her. He's just like a sidekick who's mostly there for comic relief. For Fishkin, now we get to know that that's not the real Jane. The real Jane, as Professor Fishkin brings to life in her research, is smart, is emotionally intelligent, is brave, is strategic, like audacious. He devises the Trojan horse. That's why I think we have the title, the Trojan horse, of today's lecture. He knows when to speak, when to stay quiet, and how to protect Huck, even when Huck doesn't fully realize what Jane has been sacrificing. It's not just Huck's companion, it's Huck's physical father, the surrogate father, or we can consider him as a moral compass. His love and humanity live on the page. Even we for readers and adaptation try to see him as a flat character in many cartoons. If you get a book, Professor Fishkin's new book, Jane, has a subtitle, The Lives and Afterlives of Huckleberry Finn's Comrade. Professor Fishkin showed us that Jane is far more than a sidekick or symbol. And the book contains debates on Jane, not as a name, as a taboo, or for me, he is just like a ghost in the institutional racism, a ghost who keeps haunting us. So it's good to see that ghosts get to be seen in his many Afterlives adaptations and discussion in literature classroom. Professor Fishkin has pointed out that he's one of the first fully developed black father figure in American fiction, a man navigating a cruel and unjust world, using his own intelligence, his wit and love to fight for his freedom and to protect those he cares about. So he's a challenge to the system that enslaved him and to readers who rather look away, like my youngest self. What I find most moving in Professor Fishkin's lecture is her belief that literature can still make space for difficult truth. She calls Huckleberry Finn a Trojan horse, a way to open up classroom doors to conversations that some politicians would like to shut down. Because the book is seen as part of the American literary canon, we can slip past the guards of censorship. And once inside the classroom, we can invite the students to question, to fail, to think critically about race, morality, and history, not just in America, but around the world. So this isn't just academic world, it's the courage is her compassion and her dedication to humanities. Professor Fishkin is not only telling us that Huckleberry Finn is an easy book, but also she's telling us that this is a necessary one. And she's giving us the tools to teach it with care, with honesty, with empathy, with compassion, and last but not least, with hope. So what makes her perspective so special is not just her scholarly brilliance, though she certainly has that with more than 50 books, and with her name and leadership in American and transnational studies, is that she approaches with questions with heart. She believes in the power of literature to heal, to challenge, and to connect us across time and space. Her work helps us see not only what literature has meant, but what it can still do. It reminds us that keeping voices like Jade's in the classroom is not just about preserving the past, it's about shaping a more honest and just future. So let me end by simply saying thank you, Professor Fishkin, not just for your scholarship, but for your courage, your clarity, and your unwavering belief in the power of words to make change. It leads us to believe that stories, Black stories matter. Thank you.